Action.
Roll.
All right, good. So you begin with the prayer. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bharaktu Saviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditam Mastuma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. So it's my custom to begin with questions, just to put you on the spot.
How important is it to have an attitude of indifference to good and bad? And if you don't, how to encourage that?
In the beginning, of course, we shouldn't have any indifference toward it. There should be an understanding what is good, what is bad, and continue a life that has a discriminating faculty that says we should do this because it is morally, ethically good. But you see, there's a wonderful definition of morality given by Swami Vivekananda. He links it with the quality of strength. What is morality? That which gives everybody the all-inclusive strength, the maximum amount of strength, all-inclusively. So that when we are faced with subjective or objective moral difficulties, we can use that as a formula. We can use that as a criteria to decide what is the highest moral position, particularly in subjective immorality where the rules don't seem to apply. But let's take, for example, let's take habitual drug use. I'm talking of people who are addicted to drugs. Let's say heroin. Let's say within a city there is a heroin problem, and there is a tendency to say, this is my body, I can do what I like with it. So why shouldn't I apply a certain element of a golden rule? Golden rule means do unto others as they would have do unto you. So a heroin addict might well say, everybody should take heroin because I would like everybody to experience the same thing as I'm experiencing. Well, obviously that's not a very good moral position, because what is it doing? It's weakening that person physically, psychologically. It's weakening society because they have to maintain that person. It's weakening the capacity for the taxpayer to pay. We have to set up special programs for rehabilitation and so on. So when you apply that, it's very clear that it's not a good moral position. But ultimately, we have to understand that the one that is evaluating this good and bad and so on is a transcendent position. It evaluates it from a knower, witness, thinker point of view that stands independently. And it is always good to keep that in mind. Discrimination, this faculty that we have, should always be there in the background as we go through life. Always making good moral decisions, but also understanding what is permanent and impermanent. And so this 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which we are about to start, is incidentally that Akshara Brahma Yoga. This is the yoga of the imperishable Brahman, since we know, in contrast, what is perishable. And by use of this discernment, we are able to decide what is perishable, what is non-perishable. But we get caught up in the perishable. What is perishable by definition? We can say the thing that has so many parts. And with so many parts being assembled, it will dissemble also. And anything with parts will be of a transient nature. And so when we look at all the preceding chapters and find out that nature itself is comprised of these various parts, the Sankhya's conveniently put it into some 23, 24 categories. But of course, this whole thing, this whole section of the Bhagavad Gita, starting from the 7th chapter onwards, is primarily emphasizing Bhakti Yoga. And so we may insert another category, that is Jiva. And it is by associating this Jiva, this individual soul, as it were, with this universal soul, this supreme entity, that we can tap into the grace of the Lord. Like tapping honey from a beehive. You don't just poke it with a stick, some preparation is necessary. You may have to smoke the bees out a little bit. You may have to approach it with some caution. Certainly determination must be there. But the reward is this madhu, this honey that flows from it. In this same way, devotion taps this grace, corresponding grace, from that supreme which stands in a category of its own. So what are these categories? These are known to us. What we call the world of the senses is just a gross form of subtle elements which are there. And these subtle elements, eventually, we can trace them back to a cosmic mind. So in the last section of the 7th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, those who realize me, says Krishna, in the Adibutum, in the Adideva, Adiyajna, they are of steadfast mind. Realize me, even in the hour of death. And this whole theme then is taken up by the 8th chapter. What is the greatest fear that we have? The mother of all fears is the fear of death. An association with the body is so strong. Even we find it in a baby. When you just simulate dropping a baby will clutch for dear life. This clinging to life is so strongly entrenched in us that to dissociate from us is a great, great lifelong practice. Not only this life, but many lives. And what we find here as our behavior is an accumulation of what we technically call samskaras. Samskaras, good and bad. There's no, it's not all bad, there's some good and bad. All experiences come out as an unconscious deposit within us. And so, one of these particular samskaras will be this identification of this limited aspect of life which is perishable. And so, giving an overview of this chapter is very easy to do it because the title tells us everything. That it is the yoga of the imperishable Brahman. Our gut, our normal instinct, mixes things up and says, this is perishable, this is imperishable. We mix the imperishable with the perishable. You see, there's a wonderful passage in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And there, of course, Yajnavalkya is departing for the forest life. And his one wife asks, Maitreya asks, is it worth giving me wealth? You're settling your affairs and so on and going off to the forest. But what use is wealth to me? And she brings up this question of this value. What is perishable, what is imperishable, and so on. And quietly, this great, great knowledge is told, not for the sake of the wife is the wife dear, but for the sake of the self. It goes on like that. Husband, wealth is included. In fact, everything that you find dear is not dear for its own sake, but because inside it is a glimpse of this imperishable that simulates and gives us the idea of life. And we narrow our vision and say that particular part is life. Never mind about the ocean behind it. And so we have to tune ourselves in more and more to this understanding. And we start off with a certain sense of watchfulness. And then we go into a certain sense of mindfulness or steering the attention. And then we go into an understanding of catching up with the practice, seeking strength, praying for strength. All of these things are necessary before we get to this understanding. So death is an issue. Now we've just barely gotten over a Christian festival of Easter, and it celebrates Christ rising from the dead. In other words, conquering mortality, conquering death. The question, of course, arises, if one person seeks and achieves this state of immortality, is this available to all of us? And Vedanta says, yes, it's available to all of us actually, not just to one entity. All of us are children of immortality. As the rishis say in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, oh, children of immortality, I have found that one, and so it goes on like that. So we are all children of immortality. We have to find it out. So a series of questions are asked at the beginning of this chapter. Arjuna asks for some clarification. And these are questions that all of us from time to time will ask. But in seeking the answer, we have to understand that these perishable parts, it is useful to understand in a cosmic context. And what is very good, what is very useful, what is very expert in these ancient people is to take a law and make it consistent. What law applies to this microcosm applies to this macrocosm. The science itself will have to learn this lesson. Instead of looking at all the fragmented details, have a more holistic approach. There are revolutionary scientists who would take this view. You will find the answers in a holistic approach, not in breaking things up and looking at the parts. And the more you look toward the generalization of something, the more you look toward the subtlest of things, the more you look toward the unity, the closer to the truth that you have and that you'll find. And that is why modern science is looking for a theory of everything, a grand unified field theory. This is the language of modern science. So it starts off, stanzas 1 to 8 in this chapter. It's a short chapter, and it starts off with a theme, worship of Ishvara, bearing in mind that this whole section is to do with Bhakti Yoga. And so bringing up these things that Krishna has already mentioned previously, and bringing up the subject of death. We now have a chapter that deals with not only the questions raised or the descriptions raised, but also a question about life itself and a question about death. I probably told you before, but you see, there was a man on his deathbed, and the doctor was trying to tell him somehow, in as nice and kind a way as possible, I'm sorry, there's no hope for you here. You are definitely on your way out. So please consult, somebody. Your last wish must be conveyed to somebody. Is there anybody you want to see? And after a long, long monologue about how his vitality was waning and leaving the body, and asking this question, now, is there somebody you particularly want to see? The dying man said, yes, another doctor. Another case of a man there on his deathbed, and his wife is by his side, and he doesn't really feel as if he's dying. So he says, actually, I'm not sure about this. And the wife says, no, you shut up, you keep quiet. The doctor knows what he's talking about. This great ghost of death we are unwilling to face. And all our fears, psychological fears, stem from this one thing, this self-annihilation, self-abnegation. And for that reason, the Adibutum approach is very often frightening for many people. You mean I'm going to dissolve into a nothingness? This is a kind of Buddhist approach, that you dissolve into a shunya, emptiness, nothingness. But this is not what Vedanta says. Vedanta says up front, there is an everything, there is a sum totality. And because we are not equipped to see the whole totality, we are left only with fragmented parts. And progressively we can make our way and find out what is this sum totality. And this sum totality is called Brahman. So Arjuna vacha kim tad brahma kim adhyatmam kim karma purushottama Adibutum cha kim proktam adidevam kim uchyate. Arjuna asks this question, what is Brahman? A very profound question. What is this sum totality? What is this entity that seems to be beyond this good and bad? virtue and vice, pairs of opposites, outside perishable parts, not evolving in time, no change in it, not restricted to space. Space, time and causation, this is the arena of the perishable world. And what do we mean by the perishable world? We have this phrase, from a clump of grass to Brahma, or from Brahma to a clump of grass. It means, as soon as there is an expression, a cosmic mind somewhere is what we call it. As soon as there is that, from there come all the vibrations in increasing intensity and combinations and complications until we arrive at the condensed version which looks like a you and a me in a waking world. And to trace that back, a devolution has to take place. We have to trace our way back to more and more subtle areas until finally, there you are. So what is that Brahman is the question. And then you mention Adhyatma. What is Adhyatma? What is karma in this context? And what is said to be Adibuta, and what is called Adideva? These questions are being asked, and the questions continue. Who and how is Adiyatnya here in this body? And how at the time of death art thou to be known? Or to be known by who? By the self-controlled, not by those so-called people who accept that there is a life to be lived, and at the last moment you make your will out, and in desperation you try and rescue things. It's not possible. This chapter will tell you that actually at the last moment of death, your last thought will be your first on the other side. It will be a continuation. That what we call death is just a comma, not a full stop. You carry over your baggage, just as you have carried over your samskaras, all your impressions. And when we think how many impressions there must be, everything you say, everything you think, everything you feel, everything you experience, every association, every link, every word, every argument, every praise, every blame, every moment of stress, every morsel of anger, every morsel of frustration. A frustration is the nature of life itself. Frustration is the driving mechanism for life. You see, frustration means I want something, I have a clear goal in mind, but unfortunately I'm not getting it, and I'm not getting it here, and I'm not getting it now. But in spiritual life it's very different. There's no future orientation about it, and any past commiseration is of no value. Why? Because that fullness that we are seeking is here and is now, in this present moment. If we want to look for it in the framework of time, we can see it as an opportunity not presented yet, and a feeling, an intense feeling, if we wish, of divine presence here and now. As long as we're associated with the body, we don't catch it. It's the Avakra Samhita or Gita. It tells us that as soon as we drop an association with the body, as soon as we would retreat, as it were, into our own nature of consciousness, immediately we find joy and calm and peace. Immediately. You can try it for yourself. You see, there was one person who came to me, I'm sure I've told this many times probably, but he came in a very nervous state. This person, X we'll call him. And so I said, all right, sit down. Of course, my immediate remedy is very simple, have a cup of tea. So I have a cup of tea, sit down nicely. Now we walk from that door to here. He walks, right. Who did this? I walked from here to there, right. Now, close your eyes and imagine some entity. Label it your own self. Give the name. And imagine that entity walking from the door to the chair. He did it. How do you feel? Oh, I feel relieved, immediately relieved. Yes, because you dissociated yourself from this perishable body. Just for that moment you did it. And what did you find? Instant calm, because you sat in your own nature. You sat on God's throne and beamed from there. Learn the art of doing that. So, he carries on. Adiyatnyan kato kotra dehismin madhusudana prayana kare cha katam nyeyo si dayatma bihi. Who and how is adiyatnya here in this body, and how at the time of death art thou to be known by the self-controlled? Because we can't just suddenly think of God at death. Moment of the death, memo in your diary, see, I'm passing away, my breath is getting less, I need to start thinking of God. Desperate praying. I didn't pray my whole life, but now, at this moment, Lord save me. But what's carrying through is the unconscious. All these samskaras built up is what is carrying through. You can't change that in an instant. Whatever you think of, you see that story is there about the king who decided to go into the forest. King Bharat. He went into the forest and decided to lead a retired life. Of course, in the ancient days, going to the forest wasn't a big deal. For the forest is from here to there is the forest. In the built-up urban areas is much greater distance. And so he managed to cut a long story short. You know the story. He rescued a deer, an infant deer, and fed the deer with milk. Eventually became its mother, and so on. And when the deer grew up a little bit and went long distances, there was an anxiety. Where is my child? So naturally, to cut a long story short, what you think became of that king retired in the forest in the next life became a deer. So attached to the deer was he. He became a deer in the next life. Whatever you're attached to, at your last moment, you're attached to at your first moment after the comma. It's just a continuation of the same sentence. The impetus carrying you forward, carrying you over. So in order to make sure that the last moment and the last breath contains a supreme yearning and love of God, a consistent, comfortable presence of the Lord, so that death has no fear in it. When I was in Germany, the theme that we had for the retreat was how saintly lives inspire us. And I pointed out that when we read the saintly lives, we can divide these saintly lives into parts. First part is, from my point of view, I'm very interested, what is the psychological condition, parents and environments and so on, that makes somebody inclined toward spiritual life? And then, of course, what were the environmental events around that? Who were the teachers? Who were the influential people on that person? And then, how did that person live their life? From a discipline point of view, what kind of sadhana and spiritual life did they go through? What kind of tapasya did they do? What kind of things can we pick up to imitate in terms of methodology? But last of all, before last of all, what good did they do the world? That's the other thing. But last of all, how did they die? How did they leave the body? How did they pass on? If it's said that they went into Mahasamadhi, what were the last moments of their death? Was it serene? And all these lives of these saints, the deaths are remarkable, even if there was nothing obviously remarkable about it, just that they passed away in a state of absolute peace, and that was on their face, you saw this blissful view, a beaming face, an acceptance, not only acceptance, but a gladness about it. So in the midst, even of suffering and difficulties, how they passed away like a hero or a heroine, because they knew that death is not the end. In fact, we can register at the beginning. So the Easter celebration of resurrection can remind us, if we have a will and mind to, can remind us of the fact that we are inheritors of immortality. But see the processes. So on Sunday, I was telling, some of the significances of the Easter, and how it doesn't begin with this conquering of death. It in fact begins with a period of Lent where hard discipline has to be gone through. And then at the end of discipline that symbolically removes you from slavery and takes you to freedom, 40 days. 40 days meaning a reenactment of the Jewish people leaving their slavery condition, seemingly from Egypt, and going to a promised land. And then making sure that things are in order, and then making sure that the last obstacle to freedom is removed, namely the sense of attachment to the body, as symbolized by taking this ego and putting it on a cross, and making sure that we understand there's a kind of symbolism, because the cross is an upright thing with a thing across there. Supposing this is I, you cancel it out. The last cancellation. When that cancellation occurs, what happens? This conquest of death happens, arising in your own full glory. And so, all these issues are relevant to this chapter about death and the nature of nature itself. And so, the answer comes now. The Lord says, Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, Aksharam Brahma Paramam Swabhavo Yatmam Uchate Bhuta Bhavad Bhavo Karo Vishargaha Karma Samyitaha. So, Aksharam, imperishable, this imperishable Brahma, Paramam, supreme, Swabhavaha, nature, the supreme nature, this self-knowledge, this is called or said to be, what is it said to be? Bhuta Bhava, Udbhava Karaha, which causes the origin of beings. First question, what is Brahman? The imperishable is Brahman, the supreme. Supreme meaning we have to bear in mind all the preceding categories which were there. And all those principles, here's the supreme principle. And what makes it supreme? It has no perishable parts. So it's a very simple definition. What is Brahman? That which, when you strip away all the perishable parts that are encapsulated in time and space and causation, what remains there is the imperishable, the Akshara. And when it dwells, as it were, we have to add that, in the individual body, it is called Adhyatma. What is Adhyatma? That is Adhyatma. This is the principle of Vedanta. Number one, there is a supreme principle, Brahman. Number two, there is an Atman, which is identical with that. The offering which causes the origin of beings is called karma. Karma in this context is the initial movement, the initial creative movement from which all these other things come, because karma and yajna, sacrifice and karma, are the same thing. Every action is a kind of sacrifice. You can't get something without sacrificing something. If you want to run the marathon, then you have to sacrifice your time to practice and run a little bit. If you want to sacrifice, if you want to get healthy and lose some weight, then you may have to sacrifice a few luxury foods. Everything requires some sacrifice. And so the creation, as it were, of the entire cosmos is seen as a great yajna, a great sacrifice, a great offering, a sacred event, a kind of action, because you see, in this Brahman there's no action. It is, after all, imperishable. The offering which causes the origin of being, therefore, is called karma. The intrinsic merit or property of a thing is called svabhava. And the svabhava, for example, of the sun is to put forth beams of light. And in this same way, Brahman is to appear as the multitudinous conscious beings, which we call Jivatman. So this assumption of the role of the Jivatman is called this Adhyatma. And again, in terms of this karma, we can think of this vibration of the act of becoming is taking place in the universe. But what we call this universe is nothing more than this shaking, moving, vibrating thing. And when it condenses, we call it a drama of you and me and this and that, and have a fight and a squabble and all the rest of it. And whatever work promotes the welfare of man really is karma, and so the universe is in our favor. It's not a cruel joke on us. So the next thing then, by way of explanation, is to do with Adibutum. Adibutum kshalo bhava puroscha didevatam. Adiyatnyoham eva tra dehe dehapratam bara. Adibuta pertains to what? To the perishable nature, bearing in mind that all these bhutas, these subtle elements, are the causal elements when mixed up of all of this. I alone, he says, am the adiyatnya, here in this body. That means there's a special place for an incarnation. Don't forget, yada yada hi dharmasya, from age to age I am born, in order to adjust some kind of dharma, some kind of imbalance in where harmony goes astray. So that there's a built-in harmony. We see that in nature itself. If we want to take a view of the cosmos, the only reason why it's alive and well and resulting in organic life called you and me is because of this tremendous fine-tuning, is what it's called. That if certain constants, over 20 of them, are slightly out, this whole thing not only goes out of balance, but doesn't even exist. Imagine if the gravitational constant weren't as it is, then everything would be drawn in. Everything would be into a black hole and nothing else come out. But it's not like that. Only pockets are like that. So we have this force that wants to drive everything out and expand. We have the other force that wants to bring everything in and contract. And this creates a balance. This is what we call dharma. And so we find this dharma in the psychological life, physical life, cosmological life. Everywhere we find it. And we have to have somebody, therefore, who from time to time is prepared to sacrifice themselves, as it were, and make this adjustment. Vishnu himself is identified with Yajna. His designation is Adiyajna. And so that is why this is appropriate. Divinity is present wherever an act of self-sacrifice takes place. See, it's a self-sacrificing thing. You know, it struck me, I was reading Swami Vivekananda's some of his conversations, particularly orientated toward the upliftment of humanity in time of famine and drought. One instant, of course, he was approached by an organization who were to do with the welfare of cows. Another instant was when he was discussing with the Pandit. The Pandit had asked, had thought that I will have an in-depth metaphysical conversation, something of spiritual value with the great Swami. And all the Swami could talk about was the terrible, distressful condition that his countrymen were in. And he said, I'm disappointed with this conversation. And Vivekananda's retort was, something to the effect of, if you do not have this compassion for your fellow man, if you do not uplift them, if you cannot see God in these people, then no amount of metaphysical speculation and conversation will assist. This is the real religion. This is real Vedanta. And when we have a Vedanta society in the West, where the emphasis may not necessarily be on philanthropic work programs, social activities and so on. What is our version of social activities? Everyone is suffering. More or less, everyone is suffering. Why are we having as a Vedanta society? It is for the sake of yajna, for the sake of sacrifice, self-sacrifice. It is to uplift others. It is not about our private salvation. It is not about our private information gathering. Or can we find some individual technique for ourselves or something like this? Can we find some particular meditation that we can try out? We tried a number of others. Do you have a specific one to recommend to us? No. It's about alleviating people's psychological, emotional suffering. Because Vedanta philosophy is a practical philosophy that alleviates this and has this atmosphere and attitude of yajna. So we need to sacrifice our own self-interest to a greater or lesser extent and spread this medicine, as it were, this panacea for human illness to everyone. This is why we exist as a society. It's not about studying some intellectual thing or some scriptural passages for the sake of filling up with some kind of knowledge or anything like that. No. It is to, no doubt, transform our own lives by practicing the philosophy that we hear. You know, this technique of Shravana, Manana, Utityasana, this whole idea of listening and then reflecting on it and then engaging in a meditation on it. This is necessary. This is extracted from more or less that same passage about Yajnavalkya, saying, how will you take this message? This is the process. You need to listen to what we have just said. You need now to reflect on what we have just said. When I first gave lessons on this Gita, I was trying to explain how the way we approach it is through this threefold way, because all Shastra, all scripture comes out of the fruit of meditation. And so how do we get to the original purport of it? Not just to read it. Somebody says, oh, Bhagavad Gita, yes, I read that. Yes, but did you study it? Oh, I studied it. Yes, but did you reflect on it? And then did you absorb it? Did you bring it in? Did you find out the deeper truths of it through meditation? That is how we study Shastra, scripture. So this yajna is necessary, no doubt, and we find the whole cosmos is a grand yajna, is a grand sacrifice. Sri Ramakrishna has this comment to make. He is truly a holy man whose body and mind are entirely dedicated to the Lord. That is called a yajna. He has no occupation other than being absorbed all the while in God. Knowing that the Lord is residing in the hearts of all, he devotedly serves them to the best of his ability. And these are the sure indications of a true man of God. What a wonderful passage that Sri Ramakrishna gives, illuminating what we have just said. Antakale chamam eva smaram mukta kalevaram ya prayati samad bhavan yati nastya samshayaha. And whoever, samshaya, doubt. There's no doubt about what, and whoever at the time of death, leaving the body, goes forth, remembering me alone, he attains my being. No doubt about that, no shadow of a doubt about it. Once you've saturated the mind with the love of God, then no matter what the time is, whether it's the time of day or night, at the last moment, this is what you'll be thinking of. But bear in mind, every moment is the last moment. As soon as I said moment, that was the last moment before I said it again. Every second is the last moment. So there's no holiday for this. It's not to say, oh, let me go to Spain and then when I come back I'll pick up my spiritual practice again. Or let me sort out my accounts. And after that, then I can sit and dedicate my life to God and think of God. No, constantly doing it. Because that entity is the real presence. This wonderful statement of Joel Goldsmith has become a mantra, really. That God is here, God is now, God is love for the devotee. So rehearsing this, filling every blank check called a second in, with love of God, God's presence, glorifying His presence everywhere, aligning the mind with God, all continuously worship, How many times should you repeat your mantra? See, on the retreat we gave, there's a question arose, so should we do the mantra 108 times? No, 24 hours of the day, please. As you fall asleep, do it. As you wake up, sleep. Why shouldn't it be so? Lovingly repeating God's name with great love. Should it be a burden for you? No. Significant thing, in a conversation with Ramakrishna, he was asked, so what is the most important thing? He says, love of God and prayer. Then the next question was, in which order should we practice this? Remarkably, he says, love of God first, then prayer. And you would think it's the other way around. You pray in order to get love of God. No. Cultivate the love of God, and the prayer is then a spontaneous expression of this love. Once you love a person in human relations, then converse becomes very easy and natural, isn't it? So develop that love first. That's the point. So at the time of death, this issue is very important. How will we conquer this mortality? And in what condition should we do it? And what leads up to this condition whereby we can, at the time of death, remember the Lord? Not as a desperate thing, Lord, come and rescue me, but even that is good, of course. There are so many instances of that. Rasik comes to mind, this sweeper devotee of Sri Ramakrishna, who visibly, it was known that at the time of death, he saw the Lord, Sri Ramakrishna, coming, as it were, to collect him. So what becomes of those who do not think of the Lord is a good question, but get fixed in other thoughts at the time of death. Well, the answer comes like this. Yam yam vapi smaram bhavam jajatya ante kalevaram tam tam evati kontaya sadatat bhavabhavitaha. Whatever being a man thinks of at the last moment, don't think of a donkey. When he leaves his body, that alone does he attain. Last moment, grudging your neighbor might not work out so well for you. But how do you get rid of that? See, on the last moment of your death, there are so many books on death and dying, principally by, who's the author? You know who's the author? Who's the expert of death and... Huh? No. It'll come to me now. So there's a great expert, a medical doctor, made this her life work, her life study, studying death and dying. And of course what she says is that the person undying is losing everything. The person who's surviving is only losing one person, but the dying person is losing their bank account, their house. See? All the people dear to them and so on, all of that, all the people around them, all the property and objects and emotions and people and even their cat. Now imagine now, as you pass away, having these regrets, what a pity, I will no longer see these entities again. A kind of clinging to all of that and clinging to life. That is what you'll be carrying over. And what is death? We have a dress rehearsal for it every night. Every night we vacate our personality. And we could, of course, in Shankaracharya's language, appear on, in a palace as a king or a queen in a palace and live for 1,000 years and have many, many children and live in wonderful gardens like the Versailles Palace and so on. We can do that. And then you go across to another entity where there's sleep, where there is no distinguishing factors whatsoever, no time, no space, no causation, nothing is there. And later you recall, I slept peacefully. So what becomes of you every night? Do you not vacate your waking world with all your concerns and difficulties and enter into another world? And what is sleep? According to Patanjali Yoga Sutra, sleep is dream, I should say. Dream is memory plus sleep. The memory of all your waking experiences all mixed up, and with sleep, the mixture of the two we call dream. Of course, dream seems to be very real, and there's a whole philosophy around that, as you know, 3 states of consciousness. Mandukya deals with this subject specifically as a wonderful, wonderful explanation of not just one state of consciousness, but three states of consciousness relating itself to consciousness itself that sits there. So whatever being a person thinks of, at that last moment, bearing in mind that the second is the last moment. So what then is that man or that person, what should they do for the welfare both here and hereafter? There must be a way that should be shown. Tasmat sarveshu kateshu mam anusmara yudyacha Maya pita manobhutye mam evai swasha asam sayha. Therefore at all times, no exception, no holiday, think upon me only. This is put in so many different places. Last words in the 18th chapter, fix your mind on me. Think upon me only and fight. Fight means engage in your normal activities. We have to have the skill of thinking and yet not being idle, carrying out our allocated duties. With mind and understanding set on me. You have to have the understanding first, then the mind fixed on me. You will surely come to me. Surely. Why would you insert that word? Why would you emphasize it? See, Esyasi, thou shalt come. Asamsayaha, doubtless thou wilt come to me. So the Lord's message is to sanctify the entire life. What you do, whatever activities you do, whatever thought you think, is all worship, is all sanctified, is all sacred activity. This is a great mistake that is made. When will I have time for spiritual life? Well, what do you do? I'm a, car mechanic. I see. That itself is your spiritual life. No, but I need to go to church or temple or this or that. No, that itself is your spiritual life. Find God in that activity. Understand the energy you're using. It does not belong to you. Nothing belongs to you. It's all God's energy coming through. And this is all for the greater glory of God. All these activities are there, specifically designed to be cultivated toward this realization. And have many attitudes toward it. I'm God's co-worker. If you like to think of it, that's a way. Sri Ramakrishna says this: the singing mendicant on the street artfully plays on the stringed instrument with one hand and with the other gracefully beats the drum fastened round his neck. These two items of music serve as accompaniments to his songs. In this manner, man ought to discharge his worldly duties carefully and at the same time, be inclined Godward. He should imbibe godly tendencies more and more. You have this misunderstanding that to be spiritual, we have to have the opportunity of retiring. I mentioned these stories of retiring to the forest and so on and so forth. But after doing all your duties, and after concluding all of that, see? Now, some people retire and go to Spain, or some people retire and do some other things. Or some people are forced into old age homes in this country and many other countries in the Western world. But here, a pursuit of spiritual life continues. And don't remain idle. So the way of leaning towards Vanity, what is that? Abhyasa yoga yuktena chetasana yagamina paramam purusha divyam yati parta nuchintayan. Abhyasa yoga is the way. Constant practice. With the mind not wandering after anything else, made steadfast in the yoga of constant practice. The one who meditates on the Supreme, resplendent Purusha, meditates means thinking all the time, feeling a constant presence, tuning the mind into the glorious broadcast that is God's grace. Not wandering after anything else, made steadfast in what? This yoga of constant practice. What should we do? Abhyasa yoga. Means constant remembrance wherever we can. Naturally we do it when we have a human relation. Just as that king who retired in the forest was constantly thinking of the deer. Constantly think of that. Naturally, what happened was, his next thought on waking, called another life, is all full of deer things. I am a deer, I like the forest, I like eating grass, and I like staying close to hermitages and holy places. And then maybe the realization dawns. Then that becomes next life, born in a holy condition. As somebody who decided, I won't speak at all. That's another story. So he meditates on what? On the supreme, resplendent. Purusha is a wonderful term, a mix of Puri and Purna. See, the indweller of a city and that which is full, lest we make a mistake that there's something encapsulated in something like a cage. Something that pervades everywhere. And resplendent, something like the sun. We have the greatest example of resplendent when we see the sun shining in glory, greeting us in the morning. And see how these summer days are so long and so beautiful. See how our mood changes when it's a sunny day, along with our complexions, no doubt. We see how the sun, even when we closed the curtains and the shutters, the sun was still there, present there in the west, as a visible orb, just going down nicely. From time immemorial, people have observed the same sun. To the extent that, of course, we have Surya as a kind of branch or a kind of approach or a kind of sect. Shankaracharya mentions 5 such, Vaishnavites, Shaivites, but the sun, worshippers of the sun, is another way. Because when we visualize the sun, we see the resplendent symbol of life, of energy. There was a Lutheran man called Bohm who got into trouble for his unconventional thinking in the 17th century. And his unconventional thinking was to view God in these terms of life, light, and love. And something like the sun. So fire for him and light represented life for him. And then we find, using the same image of the sun, that it also was light, the light of consciousness. And it's resplendent. It shares its life-giving aspect everywhere with everybody. What a beautiful thing the sun is. So in the yoga exercise, what do we do? One of the first things we do is a salutation to that sun, Surya Namaskar. So, Supreme Resplendent Purusha reaches him. Each sadhaka, each spiritual practitioner has his own concept of Ishvara. And this, of course, is called Ishtamurti or Ishtadevata, or chosen identity. And lifelong meditation on that phase of Ishvara is really what is called Abhyasa Yoga, this constant practice, or constant reflection, constant remembrance, practicing a constant presence. Because of his residing in this Puri, in this body, this city, constant thought of him rids this spiritual aspirant of body consciousness. We don't have to divorce ourselves from association with the body. Merely looking toward God, we do it. So there's always the example, how do you conquer your shadow? Well, you can ambush it. That won't work. You can stab it. You can, hide behind a rock and jump out. No, it's there behind you. See? So there's nothing you can do except face the sun and start walking, and the shadow obediently follows. Instead of conquering your shadow, stabbing it, or giving it a lecture, or trying to get rid of it. And shadow is a very significant term, because shadow is psychology speak for these deep-rooted, unhealthy samskaras that are with you. These deep-rooted fears, which are branches of this mother of all fears, that is the fear of death. How do we conquer this? We'll face toward the sun, representing this glorious Lord, this resplendent entity, and the shadow will obediently follow you. So there we leave off. Next week we'll pick up a different theme, and that is how the yogi then relinquishes the body as a model for all of us to practice. And then from there on, it goes on to deciding what happens after this mortal frame gets resolved. Are there various paths and avenues we can take? And it turns out there are. And we'll discover all of this in this short 8th chapter called Akshara Brahma Yoga. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.